Imagine you wake up tomorrow and Russia is gone from global trade. No oil, no gas, no fertilizer, no palladium, no enrichment services. Not because of a war, not because of a blockade, because the Kremlin slams the door and says, fine, leave without us. Putin supporters love to wave this idea like a doomsday button. The world depends on Russia. Be nice, or you'll freeze. You'll starve. Your factories will stop. But here's the real question. If Russia locks itself out of global trade, who actually takes the hit first? Who freezes this quarter? Who starves next season? And who quietly gets rich? I'm Elvira Bary, a writer born in the Soviet Union. Today, I'll give you a choke point map of what Russia really controls and what it only pretends to control. Here's our roadmap, the choke point map. What valuable resources Russia exports today? Energy panic. What if Russian oil and gas stop flowing? Bread shock. What if Russia stops exporting grain and fertilizers? Factory metals. How important is Russia's supply of nickel and palladium? Nuclear bottleneck. Who gets hit if Russia discontinues uranium exports and related services? The parallel plumbing. Why trade with Russia is likely to find a workaround rather than stop completely. Winners and losers. Who benefits most in this scenario? And why Russia won't be among them? If you want to keep conversations like this going, subscribe, like, share, or join my think tank, or support via PayPal or Super Thanks. You can also get this video free high points, so more people see it. And for those watching or listening on Spotify, please follow this show on Spotify. It really helps. Now, let's look at the map. The choke point map. Russia is not a modern economy that sells phone software or medicines. Most of its exports are commodities or raw materials: crude oil, refined products, pipeline gas, coal, metals, fertilizers, and food staples. Crude petroleum and refined petroleum sit at the top of Russia's trade, followed by petroleum gas and coal. This matters because it changes the kind of damage Russia can cause. If a country stops exporting cars, you don't lose cars tomorrow. You lose them in 6 months. Then you pay more. Then you start buying different models. But if a country stops exporting oil, you feel it before lunch. But here's the first trap. People confuse big with irreplaceable. Russia is a big supplier in several markets, but that doesn't automatically mean the world has no alternatives. In commodities, alternatives exist. They are just expensive, slow, or politically messy. Take oil. Russia produces about 10 million barrels per day in 2023, around 11% of global production. If that vanished overnight, the world would not run out of oil. It would run out of calm. Prices jump first. Then governments tap reserves. Then producers elsewhere try to ramp up. The system adjusts, but not politely. Now, take pipeline gas. Gas is less global than oil because infrastructure locks it in. Europe learned this the hard way, but eventually adapted in a matter of years, not decades. Russia's share of EU pipeline gas imports fell from over 40% in 2021 to about 11% in 2024. That drop tells you two things at once. One, dependence can be reduced rather quickly. Two, it's still painful enough that you only do it when history forces you. So when we say Russia closes off, we also have to define what closed means. Is it a Kremlin decision? Or is it shipping insurers refusing coverage, ports refusing entry, banks refusing payments, and buyers deciding the discount isn't worth the headache. Because the modern world does not need a perfect blockade to create a shock. It only needs friction. Here's a cleaner way to think about it. Russia's exports fall into two categories. First, large volume commodities where alternatives exist, but the transition is violent. Oil is the best example. Second, niche inputs where Russia's share is not technically large, but it sits in a local bottleneck, such as a specific supply chain built over decades. That second category is where factories break. Not because there's no supply, but because replacing it takes time, approvals, and redesign. So the right question isn't, can the world live without Russian imports? It certainly can. The right question is, who can live without them this quarter?
Find out who he really is.
Officially, Klim Rogov's biography read like something safe and respectable. A journalist from New York, a foreign correspondent working for a prestigious news agency. In reality, Klim Rogov was a white emigre. And if that truth were ever exposed, he would be arrested on the spot.
Very interesting.
He came to the Soviet Union for one reason only, to find his wife abducted by the Bolsheviks. And he did find her, just not where he expected. It turned out she had caught the attention of the only red millionaire in the entire country, a man inexplicably allowed to run a private business in a state supposedly devoted to building socialism. A man powerful enough to break the rules in Stalin's Moscow.
Will you catch him?
We'll catch them all.
Energy panic. Energy is one input that touches everything. Virtually every other product or service has energy baked into the cost. Start with Europe, because that's where we already watched a lighter version of this move. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Europe had to scramble for alternatives to Russian gas. That scramble triggered a severe supply shock. European gas prices surged roughly fourfold in the first 6 months of the war. When you lose pipeline gas, you don't simply buy more somewhere else. You have to fight for LNG cargoes, pay up, burn different fuels, cut industrial demand, and subsidize households. Now zoom out to oil. If Russian crude disappears tomorrow, the first response is panic buying. Refiners, traders, and governments all try to secure barrels at the same time. That creates the spike, even before any physical shortage hits. And here's the twist. Even under sanctions, Russian oil doesn't simply vanish, it reroutes. In January 2026, Reuters reported that China was set to receive nearly 1.5 million barrels per day of Russian oil by sea, up from about 1.1 million in December, as flows shifted away from other buyers under tougher Western sanctions. A trader involved in Russian oil sales shared that as Indian and Turkish buyers cut purchases, some Urals cargoes headed for China, and the surplus weighed on prices. The numbers matter, but the lesson matters more. Closed rarely means zero exports. It often means exports at a discount to fewer buyers through more intermediaries with more risk priced in. Now add refined products, because this is where ordinary people notice. In late 2025 and into January 2026, a new wrinkle tightened the system. The EU's restriction on importing petroleum products made from crude oil of Russian origin, even if the refining happened in a third country. The rule entered into force on January 21. Why does that matter? Because big buyers of Russian crude had also been exporting diesel. If the EU closes that door, demand patterns shift again. Cargoes move, discounts widen, someone pays more at the pump. So who suffers first in an energy closure world? Not the West in general. Most countries will adapt. The most exposed are small import-dependent economies that can quickly switch fuels, can quickly expand LNG infrastructure, and can stomach a sudden spike in household bills without political consequences. And Russia itself will suffer the worst consequences. Oil and gas exports are the main source of federal budget income, with them drying by half, let alone disappearing. The Kremlin will struggle to keep the country under control. The risk of social unrest or even a revolution will grow much stronger. Bread shock. When Russia cuts off its food and fertilizer exports, the markets will respond with a price spike. And the countries that feel it faster are those whose food supply chains are already fragile. Start with wheat. In 2024, Russia exported about 50 million tons of wheat, close to a quarter of global exports. A sudden loss of this volume will be hard on the market, but not catastrophic. Over time, buyers will find replacements. Now add logistics. Russia's own central bank has acknowledged that EU vassal sanctions weighed on Russian grain exports. Russian officials have kept trying to tie safe navigation deals in the Black Sea to easing restrictions around food and fertilizer trade. Fertilizer is the quieter knife because the damage shows up with a delay. Russia is a prominent exporter of potash and nitrogen alongside Belarus. In late 2024, Russian potash exports were in the 12 to 13 million ton range, with Belarus around 10 million. Together, they account for a third of the global supply. And the global market has already lived through how a withdrawal feels. A big shock, then normalization, then everybody tries to pretend it was a one-time event. The problem is that fertilizer shocks quickly show up on the ground. In July 2025, Reuters described how US sanctions wreaked chaos on Latin American farms that run on Russian fertilizer. For example, Mexico imported more than $580 million of Russian fertilizer the year before. Avocado growers were warning that their prices could soar. Europe isn't immune. In 2023, Russian fertilizer made up about a quarter of EU fertilizer imports by volume. EU lawmakers backed tariff hikes designed to reduce that dependence. Those tariffs have already raised costs for European farmers. That's the trade-off you can't avoid. If you cut a supplier that used to deliver reliably, you buy security with money. But you still don't end up starving or bankrupting your agriculture industry. You just pay more to keep things running. Factory metals. Russia's closure becomes truly painful when it hits metals that are necessary for manufacturing industries. One clear example is palladium that sits inside automotive parts. Russia is the world's leading producer of palladium, supplying 75 tons per year, or 40% of the global supply. That concentration is the real risk. If Russian palladium gets cut off quickly, The world can try to substitute, recycle more aggressively, and redesign. But the first reaction is always the same. Prices jump and automakers pay the bill. A second example is nickel. Nickel is not rare, but the grades matter. Russia's Norilsk nickel is one of the world's major producers of refined nickel. However, its share is not enough to rock the global market, only about 5% of supply. In recent years, the company redirected sales to Asia as Western buyers avoided Russian metal and payments got complicated. Now bringing in titanium with its special role in aerospace. In April 2024, Canada imposed sanctions on Russian titanium but granted Airbus a waiver so the company could change its supply chains, which takes time. Then, in August 2025, Russia said it hoped to resume a titanium joint venture with Boeing, while also noting that Boeing had suspended buying Russian titanium in 2022. Metals are a perfect choke point for Russia, not because Russia can turn off airplanes, but because it can raise the cost and complexity of building them by injecting uncertainty into already strict systems. So who suffers most if Russia closes tomorrow? Industries with long certification cycles take the blow. Automakers, because they can't stop producing for long without bleeding cash. Aerospace, because every alternative supplier has to fit into a tight approval regime. And heavy manufacturing, because you can't swap imports overnight without messing up the line. The world adapts, yes, but it adapts by paying more, waiting longer, and accepting higher risk in the meantime. Nuclear bottleneck. Nuclear fuel is where replaceable stops being a comforting word. Russia controls almost a half of the world's uranium enrichment capacity. If Russia closes tomorrow, you won't see a nuclear blackout the next day. Reactors don't work like that. Utilities keep inventories and the fuel cycle is planned years ahead. But nuclear is still one of Russia's most awkward choke points because the dependency isn't only about mining uranium, it's about services, conversion, enrichment, and the ability to fabricate fuel assemblies that match specific reactor designs. Europe is the cleanest case study because it has been trying to unwind this dependency in public slowly and with visible discomfort. In 2024, the EU imported a little over 700 million euros in Russian uranium products, out of 22 billion in Russian energy imports. Even after the gas shock, nuclear fuel was still flowing for lack of alternatives. Today, Russia is still supplying around 23% of Europe's enriched uranium, and that some countries had stockpile fuel for. Smaller countries like Hungary and Slovakia are still heavily reliant on Russian uranium to power up their Soviet-era reactors. Now zoom in on the VIVER reactors, the Russian-designed units operating in parts of Europe. Western firms have been working to develop non-Russian VIVER fuel options. In Germany, there were political problems around plans tied to manufacturing VIVER fuel elements as environmentalists protested. Even without such a position, switching nuclear fuel takes engineering, licensing, and years of cautious testing. The parallel plumbing. Commodity trade acts like water finding cracks. Block one pipe and the flow looks for another. Slower, dirtier, but still making it out. Here's a fresh scene that shows it in one frame. On January 23, the French Navy redirected an oil tanker called Grinch to Marseille 4, suspecting it was part of Russia's shadow fleet. The ship was sailing under a Comoros flags and had left Murmansk earlier in the month. That's what closure looks like in real life. The shadow fleet is the world Russia built to keep exporting when the West tries to make exporting painful. Old tankers, shell companies, fast flag changes, Insurance that is not Western, questionable or hard to verify. That's how Russian oil trade found a way around sanctions. But these workarounds comes with risk, and risk has a price. Even if a cargo is technically legal for a buyer, ports still ask, who insures this ship? And will the insurer actually pay if something goes wrong? In November 2025, an Indian port delayed the discharge of a Russian oil cargo because of insurance scrutiny. From January 21, the EU made it illegal to import petroleum products that contain crude oil originating in Russia, even if that crude was refined outside the EU. Sweden's customs agency spelled out the documentation requirement. The European Commission published detailed FAQs on what evidence importers and traders must share to prove crude origin. That is a pain in the neck by design. It forces refineries, traders, banks, and insurers to act like investigators. And the more steps you add, the more deals die from exhaustion. But still, they don't die completely, as long as the trade is profitable for everyone involved. So if Russia closes, what happens first? Its own elite builds workarounds and keeps selling to those who need this supply to survive. The buyers will just have to pay extra for risk and complexity. Winners and losers. In the Russia stops trading with the rest of the world scenario, the biggest losers are the economies that still have a physical tether to Russian fuel and can reroute overnight. A clean example is Serbia. In January, the US extended a sanctions waiver tied to Serbia's Russian-owned refiner NIS, explicitly to avoid fuel shortages. If Russia truly stops trading, these kinds of edge cases become the headline because they are the places where molecules have to keep moving or politics explodes. Europe as a bloc is less exposed than it was in 2021, but it still has vulnerable corners, especially where infrastructure and legacy contracts narrow the menu. Now zoom out to the global south, where the losses show up as food inflation and budget stress. If Russian fertilizer and grain are gone, import-dependent countries face a double hit. First, they pay more for the same ton of wheat. Then, they pay more for the fertilizer that protects next season's harvest. That second hit arrives later, and it's nastier because it squeezes domestic production, not just imports. The next loser group is industrial manufacturing, but only where Russia sits in the supply chain. The factories can adapt, but not overnight. Then there's nuclear fuel cycle services. The countries that rely on them will have a major problem on their hands, but the impact will not be instant. They'll have years to find a replacement before their plants feel a shortage. Now, the winners. Energy exporters win first because they sell into a spike. Norway, which has already become the EU's top gas supplier, wins by being connected and reliable. The United States wins through LNG volumes and pricing power, especially as Europe leans harder on LNG in the post-2022 landscape. Qatar and Algeria also win because they become the other phone you can call when everyone starts dialing at once. In fertilizers, Canada is the obvious winner on potash. It's the largest producer, accounting for another third of global supply. When Russia and Belarusian supply tightens, every buyer suddenly rediscovers Saskatchewan on the map. In nuclear, any non-Russian enrichment provider wins on margins and leverage. Urenco's recent expansion decisions are a tell. When a system realizes one supplier is too big, it pays to build capacity elsewhere. And Russia? In this scenario, Russia is both the author of the shock and one of its biggest losers. A full stop in trade is not a clever tactic but a self-amputation. You give up hard currency, you accelerate permanent substitution, and you train your former customers to design you out of their future. Now I want to hear from you personally. Have you ever lived through a real shortage? Fuel, food, medicine, heat, even cash at the ATM? What was the moment you realized normal life can break faster than people admit? Thank you for watching. If you want more of this kind of analysis, please subscribe, like, and share. And if you'd like to support this channel, you can join my think tank or use PayPal or Super Thanks. You can also hit the hype button if it's available. It helps the video travel. And for those watching or listening on Spotify, please follow this show on Spotify. It really helps.